I think that like stepping back from just trying to explain the phenomenon of overlapping communities is to ask the question, like, why do we even have the online communities that we do? And this is actually a pretty hard question to answer, in part because the distribution of participation is so unequal. But it's an important question because these online communities that are arriving, they structure who is producing what for whom and where online.
That was UMSI postdoctoral research fellow Nathan TeBlunthuis during a 2023 talk at UMSI, and this is Information Changes Everything, where we put the spotlight on news and research from the world of information science. You're going to hear from experts, students, researchers, and other people making a real difference. As always, we're presented by the University of Michigan School of Information, UMSI for short. Learn more about us at si.umich.edu. I'm your host, Kate Atkins. Today, we'll hear more from Nathan TeBlunthuis' 2023 talk during the UMSI Data Science and Computational Social Science seminar series. TeBlunthuis' research examines overlapping online communities on platforms like Reddit and Facebook. Before we jump in, a few other people and projects that you should know about. First, Kamala Harris's campaign is leveraging memes, Gen Z humor, and pop culture to energize voters. But according to UMSI Assistant Professor Chelsea Peterson Salahuddin, the key to success will be whether this energy translates into actual voter mobilization. She emphasizes that moving from sharing memes to taking real-world action is crucial for turning online enthusiasm into votes. Next, UMSI Assistant Professor Robin Brewer received the 2024 Henry Russell Award for her outstanding contributions to research, teaching, and mentorship, particularly in the areas of accessibility and inclusive technology design. Brewer's research focuses on designing voice technologies for older adults and their caregivers, disability representation in language learning models, and also privacy concerns of disabled people when using AI-powered assistive technologies. Finally, did you know that historic public radio and television programs like The French Chef and Watergate hearings coverage are available to the public through the American Archive? This joint project of the Library of Congress and WGBH Boston has a goal of preserving the most significant public television and radio programs of the past 60 years. And they're looking for volunteers to help edit their computer-generated transcripts. For more on all of these stories, check out si.umich.edu or click the link in our show notes. Now, back to Nathan TeBlunthuis.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about a bunch of work that I've done trying to use a framework from sociology of organizations called organizational ecology to understand online communities. This has been work that I've done over the course of my PhD and my previous postdoc, and yeah, I'm really excited to share it with you. I want to start by kind of framing it with this quote from Kevin Munger, who says, in urging us to sort of consider the importance of doing more descriptive research about social media, is that we need to ask the question of like, what is it? What is social media? What is being produced and consumed on these platforms? Who is consuming it when? The fact is that we don't spend enough time on these basic first steps. We ask the wrong questions. So then there's a lot of funding and urgency around questions around misinformation and around like political polarization and other important topics. But these media systems are still so new and rapidly changing. And it's actually been very difficult for us to keep up with how are these systems actually working at a more fundamental level. And so this is something that I think, even though I'm working with some higher level concepts than just, who's producing what, where, and when, in spirit, I'm trying to do, describing what's going on. And one thing that's going on, which I think is just basically puzzling, is that if you look at places like Reddit or Facebook groups, it's puzzling to me that like you have two subreddits, one cycling and one bicycling, that are both reasonably large, reasonably active. It's seemingly about, the same exact topic. And then it's sort of puzzling, well, why are people doing that? And then you also have these other communities that seem to have their own topics, like fixed gear bicycling or bike commuting. But it's also puzzling that like they can't just be like sort of subsections of our cycling, for example, right? Because Reddit apparently has affordances that could support that, but it doesn't seem to be what's happening as much. Instead, people are creating many different overlapping groups. And I'm not the only one who's been interested in this question of these overlapping subreddits. In fact, there's been a lot of work in social computing and HCI about it before mine. And a lot of it's actually happened and been done by people here at University of Michigan. So we know that membership overlaps often, but not always coincide with topic overlap. We have evidence that when these communities are overlapping, sometimes they seem to compete with each other, and other times they seem to mutually benefit each other. I'm going to talk a lot about those concepts and how I've built on that in this talk. And then we also have evidence that these overlapping groups are a mechanism for the spread of hate speech and misinformation and political polarization in places like Reddit and Facebook groups. We also think that like the way that these systems evolve is importantly related to these overlapping groups, because when you find new communities that spring up, they don't spring up, from nowhere. They are often emerging from previous communities and inherent characteristics from those communities. So there's a lot of work about this in various ways, and these are just to highlight a few ones that I'm trying to build on most directly. Stepping back from just trying to explain the phenomenon of overlapping communities is to ask the question, like, why do we even have the online communities that we do? This is actually a pretty hard question to answer, in part because the distribution of participation is so unequal. But it's an important question because these online communities that are arriving, they structure who is producing what for whom and where online. There's sort of two different modes of explanation that you could use to try to explain like why we have a certain online community, why is a particular online community succeeding, even though so many of them are failing. And one motivating example to illustrate the difference between internal and external explanation is that of Wikipedia's rise and decline. So a lot of my research is about Wikipedia and has been motivated by it. And this is a chart that I think about all the time, which is that you have this sort of meteoric rise in the early 2000s in the number of editors to Wikipedia. And then it starts declining in in 2007. And this has been attributed to institutions that were developed to promote quality control and moderate Wikipedia, but that also deterred new editors. And this relationship between the rise and decline of knowledge production projects and their institutional development appears to be generalized. Well, some of my own early work, I found that in hundreds of other wikis, they exhibited this sort of rise and decline pattern, and this accompanied this rise in institutions. So there's some evidence that this internal mechanism is important here. But at the same time, that Wikipedia transitions from rise and decline is when Facebook starts taking off. And you start seeing this really big shift in the modes of online communities and the modes of social media from these early like participatory collaborative production modes like wikis to more like individualist social media. And, I'm sort of just deeply curious about like how much of Wikipedia's transition from rise and decline is because of these sort of internal structures, these barriers to contribution, or how much of it could be due to like competition with the alternatives or the new forms of social media that emerge. Now, this is actually a very difficult question to answer, in part because we just don't have enough like good data about like who was participating where on and when on these platforms. But when we go back to Reddit, now we actually have a lot of really fine-grained data on like who is commenting or posting in which subreddits and when. And so I'm turning to Reddit to sort of try to develop concepts and some methods that you could use to answer these questions and really to understand more dynamically more concretely just these puzzles about like overlapping communities and why they exist. So now I'm going to introduce organizational ecology. I'm going to start with, I think, the theory of organizational ecology that was first adopted by like social computing researchers back in the 2010s. And this is a framework called density dependence theory. And so the key concept in density dependence theory is density. And this is conceived of as how much two different groups' niches are overlapping. A niche is usually defined as sort of some group's territory or organization or online community's territory in some high dimensional abstract resource space. Concretely, this gets operationalized in my studies and in previous ones as overlaps in user bases or in topics. And we can also talk more near this, and I'll discuss how maybe there's some limitations in that operationalization of niches that's important, that could be limiting the usefulness of this framework, but I'm going to save that for later. So we want to understand, we're going to try to use this concept of density, sort of how much niches are overlapping, to get at competition. So how much when there's a relationship between two groups that's going to hurt growth of one or both of them, and sort of the opposite of competition or the converse of mutualism, or sort of how much is that relationship promoting their growth. So the goal here is to try to like understand how much mutualism and competition are structuring this sphere of different overlapping online communities. And there's this trade-off between mutualism and competition as a function of density. So at the low range of density, you're doing something that's very novel. And so you don't benefit from those potential spillovers of like information, legitimacy, or that would help you succeed as a firm or as an online community. But then as you reach a high range of density, now you're suffering from competition, right? So there's this sort of idea that there's a sweet spot in the middle where you're not doing something that's totally weird, but you're also not doing something that everyone else is trying to do, and where it's very difficult to compete. So now I'm going to do a little bit of a digression to a study that I've been working on for a very long time. And it shows, I think, how density dependence theory can be useful. And this is a study about change.org. So it's not quite online communities, but online collective action. And even more on Reddit, you find than on Reddit, on change.org, you find petitions that are like super similar. So this just demonstrates like 4 petitions about like against a particular dog meat consumption festival in the Philippines, and they all get like a certain number of signatures, right? I'm just trying to show that there's like a lot of similar petitions, right? And I wanted to sort of use this density dependence framework to see, okay, are these petitions going to compete with each other? When there's more similar petitions, are they going to be more likely or less likely to get signatures, right? And you might think that they get more because maybe they're all sort of contributing to the same social movement, but you might also think that they're going to compete with each other over the time and attention of signatures, right? So I started with petitions from change.org, and then I took the token frequencies from their texts, topic model them, and then used that to create a similarity measure based on Jacquard similarity. I'm going over this really quickly because I want to talk more about Reddit than change.org, but then you can basically aggregate these similarities within a month, and then that gives a measure of density. So basically how many petitions are similar to yours and how similar are they? And then put that into a regression model that predicts signature counts. And then this is the main result. Marginal effects plot shows this sort of downward phasing curve. So instead of the inverse U-shaped curve, which would indicate this trade-off between mutuals and competition, instead I found just competition. And in this case, the effect size is I think, reasonably important, right? So at the lower level of density, petitions are predicted to get between 2 and 200 signatures in the 95% interval. But then if you go down to the low range of density, it goes down to between 0 and 41. And basically the chances of your petition taking off and getting a lot of signatures are extremely low on this platform to begin with. But if you're in a high density context, it's even less likely. And it basically shows that the competition across the entire range of this density measure is stronger than mutualism. That's like the theoretical interpretation. And the implication of this is that even though this platform is, insinuating that people creating similar petitions are sort of all part of the same movement, and that there's this idea of they're helping to build a movement. In fact, they generate revenue by selling advantages in this competitive environment. Okay, so that's a digression. Let's go back to online communities. I just wanted to show that density dependence theory can be useful and can result in some explanatory power. So going back to Reddit, I want to talk about how instead of this world of commercial firms that organizational ecology was built up in, this actually looks like a world where people are not, these different online communities are not really competing with each other over resources. There's some evidence here that they're complementary in some way. I wanted to try to explore the dynamics of these interactions. And I'm going to talk about how I do that. I'll talk a little bit more about why. One is sort of these limitations of the VAR model, and then also trying to understand these bursty attention dynamics. But also it's to try to understand more about the process by which these communities are forming and why they're forming in these ways that produce this mutualistic clusters. So first I wanted to sort of replicate the finding about the widespread mutualism, but with a dynamical model. We talked to members of these communities and they talked about how they saw different types of benefits. There's trade-offs between these 3 different types of benefits. If you want to find a large audience, that can make it more difficult to find the specific types of content that you're looking for. It can also make it harder to find a community of people who are similar to you, which is something that people want. And then there's sometimes a tension between finding the specific content and finding people who are similar to you, because you might want content from people who are different from you, people who know something that you don't, people who have experiences that you haven't had, but that you want to know about. Now I'm going to sort of talk about sort of the other motivation for doing this sort of dynamical version, which is to try to understand how the processes by which these are forming. And looking that sort of back in ecology, there's a lot of theory about specialization and the relationship between specialization and competition, and mutualism. So if you want to avoid, this is also classic sort of business model strategy, right? If you want to avoid competing in a market, in a competitive market, you need to differentiate your business model. And so you might ask, are these online communities adapting to increase specialization and thereby promote more mutualism? So is that a mechanism? And so to answer that question, I hypothesized that 2 communities that had greater competition would subsequently have greater decreases in overlap. And you can also take the inverse. So the communities that have the greater mutualism, will they have the greater increases in overlap? And then you can ask, is that kind of adaptive process actually effective at changing these ecological dynamics? So when two subreddits, if they decrease in overlap, will that decrease their competition? If they increase their overlap, will that increase their competition or decrease their mutualism? Now to do this, I'm going back to sort of ecologists, and they often also have to deal with situations where like you have bursty dynamics in biological populations where fish are migrating or cicadas are suddenly emerging out of nowhere in the spring or summer. And so they use kind of model called a SMmap. And the idea of an SMmap is that for each community, you want to try to estimate the ecological interactions of all the other communities on it at each point in time. And the strategy is to basically use an OLS regression, but with a carefully constructed weighting matrix. And the weighting matrix is designed to give greater weight to periods of time in the past that are similar to the present. I don't want to get into too much of the nitty gritty about that. It does take a hyperparameter W, which I use grid search to optimize. And the intuition of this is that we're going to just try to forecast what's going to happen based on what happened last time the system was in a similar state. And then so think about the number of parameters here in this model. We basically have an enormous number of potential parameters. And so for that, to make this work, you need some pretty heavy regularization. So in summary, I found that mutualism is more common than competition. Mutualistic interactions are both more frequent and longer lasting. This is triangulated with some qualitative evidence. There's also room to improve the quality of this evidence. Using the SMmap models, I found that ecological relationships among these online communities were often bursty and short-lived, and that when they tend to specialize more when there's more competition, but the specialization doesn't really seem to decrease the competition. So we can interpret that as saying that these subreddits are adaptive, but this adaptation isn't explaining the preponderance of mutualism. But yeah, we want to consider, so in future work, I want to try to consider dimensions beyond topic and user overlap. This is another thing that came out of the interview study, right? So those people don't talk about like, there's different people in these different subreddits, or they have really different topics. They talked about like what kinds of benefits they're getting from these communities, what kinds of uses and gratifications they have, right? So those might be related to the topic, or they might be related to who's there, but that's not really what, those are sort of like the mechanisms by which people are getting what they want, but that's not exactly what they want, not all the cases. So I'm interested in thinking about how we might, so some of those other niche dimensions might be things like institutional frameworks, the kinds of rules they have, the kinds of content they allow. Then we also want to study selection mechanisms. This sort of big SMmap project got us an angle on the adaptive process, but I think it's actually maybe a more natural explanation that especially when you're looking at like subreddits that are like the top 10,000 subreddits, I'm not looking at all those subreddits that failed to really take off or sustain participation, right? And so it might be that once those subreddits that survive are those that are able to construct their niches in a way that's mutualistic with the existing subreddits. And so I'd like to find a way to model that. I also think I want to think about like what are the implications of a mutualistic environment instead of a competitive environment for how we govern these spaces. So a lot of intuitions we have about governance come from free market economies where you have competition, and competition is thought to promote processes like creative destruction, where innovation. But I think there's a risk of there being this mutualistic environment that you're lacking some of those mechanisms that we assume are there for innovation. Instead, we have to maybe wait for like communities that are stagnant to sort of decay, and then new ones to replace them. And then as part of that, so I want to try to connect these concepts to community governance, trust, and safety. And then I also want to try to apply this to other types of online communities, social networks, influencer communities, and sort of my first motivation of like the peer production example. And then I think this is something that's actually pretty tractable and that we're close to doing, is to investigate cross-platform ecological dynamics. So like looking at data from related communities, but on different platforms.
You can watch the full talk by clicking the link in our show notes. To learn more about upcoming events like this, visit us at umsi.info/events. And make sure to subscribe to Information Changes Everything wherever you listen to podcasts, so you never miss an episode. Before we go, remember that UMSI offers a fully online master's degree in applied data science. Join the leaders and the best by earning a University of Michigan master's from anywhere in the world. To learn more, visit umsi.info/mads. The University of Michigan School of Information creates and shares knowledge so that people like you will use information with technology to build a better world. Don't forget to subscribe to Information Changes Everything on your favorite podcast platform. And if you've got questions, comments, or episode ideas, send us an email at umsipodcast@umich.edu. From all of us at the University of Michigan School of Information, thanks for listening.